Hey guys, welcome to another video for anatomy and physiology. And in this video we're going to be taking a look at ascending pathways. And this is just a general overview of ascending pathways. This topic can be pretty complicated. It's super complex. I mean, again, we're talking about the nervous system, so there's millions upon millions of neurons that go throughout the entire body. But we're going to just take a general overview of how a nervous signal can be sent from a pressure receptor, temperature, pain receptors in the hands. I mean, these things they cover basically the entire body for the most part. And there are some locations that have more receptors than others, like your hands and your feet and such. And it makes sense why when you stop to think about it. But in any case, so we want to talk about how those signals from the receptors reach the brain from point A to point B. So just like So let me just give you a quick brief introduction before I get into greater detail. So the general pathway is going to be from receptors. So let's just say, for example, your hand, imagine yourself grabbing a nice warm cup of tea or a cold drink or walking on soft grass or maybe a cold hard tile. The fact that the temperature or the texture or the temperature of what you're touching, all these receptors in the body are responsible for that, and your brain processes this information. So beginning from, let's say, the hand again, holding that warm tea, that receptor is engaged, it's initiated, and the signal is sent from the peripheral nervous system, and that's where we'll begin, is our peripheral nervous system. So it shoots up the arm, and then we're going to zoom in here, and from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, that is a specific neuron, a neuron type, and that's called a first order neuron. So as we kind of zoom in here, let me highlight the peripheral nervous system. So here you have, so the signal will go from the peripheral nervous system, and just before it reaches the spinal cord, it goes in the spinal cord via the dorsal root, right? And these of course go all throughout the entire spinal cord. So the afferent signal goes through the dorsal root, and then the efferent will come back through the ventral root. But for this video, we're just highlighting ascending signals, meaning that they are going to the brain, or they're going up. So you have the dorsal root, and then finally that signal will be processed inside of the spinal cord. Now inside the spinal cord, and again, these signals travel all the way from your peripheral to the through the spinal cord. The spinal cord has very specific pathways that these signals, depending on whether it's pain, temperature, pressure, proprioception, and again, if you remember from the previous video, proprioception is just a fancy word of your body kind of telling your brain where its specific location is. Like if you're playing basketball, you want to know how. Your body just kind of tells you where your legs are located and how they're going to move, all in a coordinated fashion to do a specific move, to do a layup or a jump shot or a crossover, or whatever the case may be. So again, the signal will travel up the spinal cord, and then once it reaches the spinal cord, and again, this is imagine the pathway on the spinal cord being a long highway. And that pathway is a specific type of neuron also. We typically call those the second order neurons. And then once the signal reaches the brainstem, here at the medulla, your pons and your midbrain, and of course we have cross sections of these sections, except the pons though. So with the spinal cord, you have long axons that travel up there, and then once it reaches the brainstem, at this point. Let me zoom out a little bit. At this point in the process, this location at the brainstem, at this location you have what's called nuclei. Okay, so this is like the major hub of where these signals get processed, and then they either get passed on to the brain or the cerebellum. That's would be right here. It's not showing there. Okay, so again, this is just a general overview of ascending pathways, starting from the peripheral nervous system, going to the spinal cord, and then traveling up the brainstem. And let's take a deeper look into these, and then finally into the spinal cord. And at this point in the spinal cord, a couple of things can happen. The nerve signal can either what's called decussation. It can cross over. So if the signal's coming from the right side, Once it enters the spinal cord, it can decussate. It can cross over and go up the contralateral side of the spinal cord, or it'll just travel up the ipsilateral, or the same side that the signal originated from. So if the signal originates from the right side and it travels up the spine on the right side, then it's said to be traveling up the ipsilateral. But if it originates from the right side and then it crosses over into the left side of the spinal cord, then it's traveling up the contralateral. Okay, so up the spinal cord, and then we're going to get into a little bit more detail as to what's happening up here in the brainstem. Okay, so remember, the brainstem is essentially what is happening in the nervous system from the foramen magnum up, right? And this is the medulla oblongata. And so the presentation that we'll have cross sections of the spinal cord, the medulla oblongata. Let me actually show you a little bit a better view of the brainstem. Okay, so here we are, the brainstem. So again, the medulla oblongata, and then just above that, you're going to have the pons. But I don't think I'll have an actual cross section of the pons. But let me remove this part of the temporal lobe here, and then I'll have a cross section of the midbrain. Okay, let me remove these right here. This is a ventricle. I'm going to remove that too. So I'll have a cross section of the midbrain, and then also of the thalamus right here that I have highlighted. Let me remove this here also. Okay, I think that's going to of the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, you'll have different neurons that go at this point. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned, but the peripheral system to the spinal cord is a first order neuron, and then the neurons that travel up the spinal cord are second order neurons. And then what happens here is we have nuclei, we have centers of processing, if you will, for those signals here in the medulla, the pons, midbrain, thalamus, and then at that point the signal will terminate at the cerebrum, and usually in the postcentral gyrus here. Okay, and then at that point the signal will then descend, going down the body, down the spinal cord, and into the muscles, causing the actions to occur that need to happen. Okay, so for example, if I'm gripping a pen, then my brain processes that I'm doing that, and then I grip the pen, and then I proceed to write with it or do whatever I need to do. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper. I just wanted to give you a bigger perspective of what we were looking at, because in the next scene, if you will, you're going to see just the cross sections of the spinal cord, medulla, midbrain, thalamus, which is one of the main processing centers just before it reaches the postcentral gyrus. And from the thalamus to the postcentral gyrus, that neuron is typically called a third order neuron. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and jump in. So as I said, we're looking at ascending tracts, neural pathways. And I've already addressed a good number of the terms, and these are the main parts that we're looking at. Again, is the spinal cord, the medulla, the midbrain, and the cerebrum. So these are the bottom three are transverse cuts, whereas the cerebrum cut is a medial cut. So we're kind of cutting from the frontal lobe all the way down to the jaw, if you will. Okay, and then that blue section you see there in the cerebrum is the thalamus, and in the midbrain and medulla you'll see different colored spots there. Those are processing centers. Those are nuclei. So when I say nuclei or nucleus, in particular when I'm speaking of the central nervous system, when I say the word nucleus, you're probably thinking of a nucleus like in the cell, but this is actually different. The nucleus, in reference to the central nervous system, think more of a hub. Okay, so I've used the analogy of a bus traveling from point A to point B as a nerve signal traveling from point A to point B. And sometimes there isn't a direct route from point A to point B, so you need to go and stop at a hub where there's other buses and get a transfer ticket, and then go hop on a different bus to reach your final destination. Well, likewise, these nuclei, these nucleus, and these processing centers in the brainstem, the medulla and the midbrains, because remember that was in the brainstem, and the medulla, that area, the brainstem, is loaded with all kinds of nuclei for all kinds of signals, for all kinds of processing. Okay, so it's a major hub. Think of like Dallas-Fort Worth Airport being a major international hub for, you can get a flight from just about to anywhere, a straight nonstop flight just about anywhere from that airport. Whereas other smaller airports, you have to, always get transferred, go to another major airport to get a transfer because there's no direct route. So that's what the medulla and the midbrain and pons do. It's a heavy processing center, okay? And then we have the spinal cord. So there are a couple of major terms that we're going to look at. One of them is spinal thalamic tract. Okay, so the word spinal meaning that the signal will travel up the spine and then end in the thalamus, which is the blue center in the cerebrum. Remember, that's a processing center in the brain, right? It's a nucleus. That's gray. So all these nuclei are actually gray matter. Okay, these are gray matter in the central nervous system. So gray matter again is an area where there's a lot of nervous tissue for processing of signaling. So spinal thalamic. So whenever you say that term, you just remember that it travels up the spine and ends in it doesn't end in the thalamus, but that's where it's this particular its final destination is in the postcentral gyrus, but just before that it ends in the thalamus. And then you have spinal reticular tract. Again, spinal referring to the fact that it travels up the spine, and then it ends. This one ends not in the thalamus, but it actually ends in a different processing center in the brainstem called the reticular formation. And that by itself is worth a whole nother video. But again, so instead of going up the thalamus, it stops at the brainstem, at the reticular formation, which is a name for one of the nuclei located there. And then the last one we're going to look at, and again, there's a lot that we can look at. There's different types, but we're just going to look at these three different ones. We're going to be looking at the spinocerebellar tract. Again, spine, up the spine, and then it ends at the cerebellum in the brain. Okay? All right, let's go. Spinal thalamic. So, spinal thalamic, the beginnings of this signal will be the first order neuron, again, the peripheral nervous system. So these are receptors for body movement, limb position, fine touch discrimination, and pressure. So these are limited to these types of sensations that you go through. Okay? So first order neuron, again, the peripheral nervous system, and then the signal goes to the spine, and then at that point it meets up and it goes to an interneuron. Okay, the signal will travel all the way up the spine, and it travels up the spine in the same side that the signal originated. So here it started on the left side and it travels up the left, and then it decussates at the medulla. And at that point, it transfers to a different type of neuron called a second order neuron. So the signal will travel up, hit one of the nuclei, decussate, and then travel up the midbrain, up the contralateral side, ending at the thalamus, right over here. Actually, so we're still midbrain, and then at the thalamus. And then at the thalamus, it hops onto a different bus, if you will, and it ends at its final destination at the postcentral gyrus for processing. And that last neuron is called a third order neuron. And then from this point, there's another process that now the signal will descend. It will go down, but we're not going to talk about that. We're only talking about ascending signals right now. So only the signals that go up the brain, not down the brain. Okay? All right, so let's look at the next one, which is spinal reticular. So the first order neuron, again, is in the peripheral nervous system. So these are sensations for pain and heat and cold. Now this one differs from the other in that it decussates at the spine, at the spinal cord itself, and then it travels up the contralateral side. And now we're in the brainstem, right? Okay, so we have an interneuron at the spinal cord, and then it travels up a different path and ending at the midbrain. Okay, or at the reticular formation. And at this point, it actually hops onto a different neuron, okay, in the midbrain, and that's the third order neuron right there. And then from that place, it goes to the thalamus, and then it goes to a fourth order neuron to its final destination. Okay, so that's how this is why I'm showing you this one, the spinal reticular, because typically your third order neuron doesn't start until the thalamus and then above. But in this case, at the reticular formation in the medulla, it hops on a different pathway a different, just a different pathway at that nucleus in the medulla called the reticular formation. Okay, and that happens a lot with a lot of these signals. Okay, now lastly, let's look at the last one. This is the cerebellar. Okay, cerebellar, so it's going to hit the cerebellum, right? Okay, so again, first order neuron to the spinal cord, and then it travels up the ipsilateral side, and then it decussates at the medulla, at the brainstem, and then at the midbrain, at the nucleus in the midbrain, instead of it going to the thalamus, which it typically does, the other signals did anyways, at the midbrain, at this particular nucleus, you hop on a different bus, if you will, and you end up taking a left, so to speak, instead of going up into the thalamus, and now you're going to the cerebellum for a different sensation. Perhaps this is more of like, the cerebellum is responsible for breathing and some coordination as well. A lot of conscious acts. That's why I like boxers, when they get hit in the back of the head, they immediately lose consciousness, because that's part of what that cerebellum does as far as the body function does. Okay, so these were just some of the examples that we have for different types of ascending going up, ascending pathways. Okay. All right. So just to kind of summarize, it goes into the brainstem. It goes through nuclei in the brainstem and at the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, a different neuron, a third order neuron, going to the postcentral gyrus of the cerebrum, and then you have the spinocerebellar. Instead of going to the thalamus, it just goes into the cerebellum, right? Okay. Now, real quick, one of the things that I didn't talk about was the names of these particular pathways. So these pathways have specific names. It's kind of like if I was going from the school to downtown San Antonio, there's specific highways that I'm going to take. They have specific names. Likewise, these pathways have specific names. Just to reiterate that point, I'm going to go back to the, you can go back to the previous video of the spinal cord, where I talk about the cross-section of the spinal cord itself. So you're looking at the H there, right? So you're looking at the gray matter of the spinal cord. And in the white matter of the spinal cord, that's where the columns are located. Remember, the gray matter and the spinal cord is interneurons. This is gray matter. And then the white matter, we're looking at the myelinated neurons. So although you can't really tell from this cross-section, each section of the white matter is a particular column, and it travels all the way up the spinal cord, ending at the nuclei in the brainstem, right? So just recall that. Remember, the brainstem is the hub, and then the spinal cord is like the long highway, right? That's the second order neuron, and that travels all the way up there. So each section has different columns, and this is actually a pretty simplified view of it. This can actually break down into much smaller pieces, but we're not going to get all super detailed on that. So just as a reminder, so for example, with the red that you're seeing on the posterior, you're looking at the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus. The gracile fasciculus would be more like towards the medial aspect of it, and the cuneate would be more towards the on the lateral aspect of the red that you're seeing. And then on the lateral side, you're seeing the posterior or the anterior spinocerebellar tract. And then on the anterior, the blue part, you're looking at the spinal thalamic columns. And these columns, again, travel all the way up through the spine. Now, not all of them travel all the way up. For example, the cuneate fasciculus, the one that's located on the lateral aspect of the red, that one doesn't really come into play until after T6, thoracic vertebrae 6, because that one receives messages from the upper body. Whereas the gracile fasciculus, that one gets signals from the lower legs, proprioception. So that, like your body's coordinating and dancing or playing sports. You have very specific movements for dribbling a ball or playing football or whatever the case may be. That's the nerve. That's the pathway that type of coordination travels through the anterior part of the spinal cord, of the posterior spinal cord, the reddish part that we have highlighted there. So again, quick nutshell. is that these pathways have very specific ways to get to these brainstem and then to the brain. And each section that you see in the white matter of the spinal cord does house a specific pathway, a specific column that takes that signal to the brainstem. And then again, these pathways terminate at the nuclei. So at the brainstem, you have a gracile nucleus, and you also have a cuneate nucleus, where these pathways end. And then at that point, at those nuclei in the brainstem, they get processed into the thalamus or into the cerebellar tract. Okay guys, well that does it for this video for ascending pathways. Okay, so we're looking at how a signal goes from a sensory receptor in the finger, in the feet, wherever the case may be, or even tendons, how a signal travels from that point, the peripheral nervous system, up the spinal tract, up the spinal cord, into the brainstem, where all the nuclei are at, and then the nuclei at the thalamus, inside the cerebrum and the brain, and then into the gray matter in the brain, like the postcentral gyrus or the cerebellum. Thanks for watching, guys, and good luck in your studying.